Good morning. I'm Susan Bell with the Hewlett Foundation, and thank you, Jane, for such a gracious introduction. Our topic is partnerships, and I cannot resist thanking my partners in this conference. Thank you, Kate Greswold, for your vision. Thank you, Jim Phils and others at Stanford for providing the intellectual and beautiful physical facilities. Thank you, Jane Wales, for everything. And thank you especially to Juliette Gimon for providing a wonderful bridge between our organizations. Second, I wish to be the first to point out that in your packets, on the right side, somewhere toward the back, is a feedback form that we'd very much like you to complete. Those of you who are conference goers know this is about the most important thing you can do for us, so thank you for your comments in advance. We will take them to heart. Our panel focuses on forming partnerships, how, when, where, and why philanthropists should consider inspiring and engaging in and funding partnerships. There are different reasons to form partnerships. For example, to bring diverse players to the table, to leverage resources, to avoid reinventing the wheel, and to share risk and information and knowledge gained. Our four panelists will help us understand partnerships. Between them, they have extensive experience with partnerships in the social sector as well as in business and government. To my far left is Peter Bell, President of CARE, the Atlanta-based Organization for International Development and Relief. Peter's career has been devoted to addressing critical global issues at CARE, at several foundations including Ford, the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and the Inter-American Foundation, and in government at the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare. Peter will address working with local partnerships. Next to Peter is Lata Krishnan, President of the American Indian Foundation. After founding and successfully selling an electronic manufacturing company, Lata turned her attention recently to founding and running AIF, an umbrella organization for building diaspora in the U.S. and around the world on behalf of India. With the strong board chaired by former President Bill Clinton, AIF is off to a great start, building U.S. and India-based nonprofits. Lata will address working with diasporas. On my near right is Adele Simmons, who has appointments at Chicago Metropolis 2020, the University of Chicago, and the World Economic Forum. As a former university and foundation president, and having been involved with global institutions in the public, private, and nonprofit sectors, Adele is the consummate problem solver and matchmaker, bringing people and resources together to focus on serious issues. Adele will focus on working with the private sector. And to my far right, and finally to kick us off, is Bill Drayton, Chair and CEO of Ashoka. As Ashoka's leading social entrepreneur, Bill believes in and has demonstrated the power of the individual in imagining and working towards systemic change that will improve the quality of life. Bill is creating a worldwide network of social entrepreneurs who are changing our world. Bill will speak now on working with social entrepreneurs. Bill?
Well, thank you, Susan, and good morning, everyone. Over the last 2.5 decades, the social half of society tipped to a very different architecture, from being bureaucratic, monopolistic, to being competitive and entrepreneurial in the same sense that business is. That is a very profound and rare moment in history when half of society changes its basic architecture. And understanding that historic change will give everyone here a better chance of finding the leverage points to have a big impact, and also to find the partnerships that will help us do that. I'm going to try to give a quick insight into that historical change, and then to draw out some of the opportunities for partnering and for leverage. Before doing that, I want to make a plea to look inward as well as to the outward opportunities. The operating half of the citizen sector has already tipped, and we need the financial services element to tip as well. There's a lot of creativity and change going on in the financial services sector. I'm using that word very intentionally rather than philanthropy to suggest a new era. We should have a financial services sector as diverse and rapidly changing as business does. And everyone here has an opportunity not only to find how to make substantive change, but in how you do your work. Give yourself permission to experiment. We need all the new models. Now, what is this historic change? Will Baumol gave me some new statistics, always very dangerous, a few weeks ago. From Rome to 1700, no per capita growth. 1700s, 20%, 1800s, 200%, the last century, over 700%. Well, what happened? Business became competitive and entrepreneurial. It went through the same profound structural change that the citizen sector is now going through. And that produced productivity growth of 2-3% a year compounding, which produces that sort of wonderful curve. The citizen half of the world tapped that wealth through the tax system to build the schools and canals. The problem was that there was no pressure to go through the internal changes that business was going through. So we remained bureaucratic, monopolistic, and fell into squalor gulch. Low incomes, low self-esteem, poor repute because miserable performance. In the 19th century, we began to break from that. You saw not one, but a number of really excellent social entrepreneurs. The abolitionists, Florence Nightingale, were just as powerful as Andrew Carnegie or John Rockefeller. They were just as great entrepreneurs. The last 2.5 decades was when the whole sector tipped. Now, I haven't seen one bar graph here the entire conference. I worked at McKinsey, so I like bar graphs. This is my cultural heritage. So if I don't, I'm not supposed to touch this thing, but I have to. So let me share with you a bar graph or two. This chart represents 4 different continents. The upper left is Indonesia. When we entered Indonesia in 1983, there was one environmental group. 15 years later, we could count over 2,000. Slovakia in 10 years went from 10 to 10,000 groups. Brazil in 20 years from roughly 5,000 to roughly 1 million. Brazil will never be the same. 1 million citizen groups. In our own country, in the 9 years here, we went from 460 to 730,000 501c3s registered with the IRS. The rate of employment growth in our sector, even in the OECD countries, is 2.5 times the rate of the economy as a whole. We're now developing very sophisticated and big organizations, second and third generation. In Bangladesh, BRAC, with 80,000 full-time employees, is 4 times bigger than the biggest business group, and Grameen is tied for 3rd place. Well, it's not just the number of groups and the size, but this is the first time I heard the phrase this morning for years of drops in oceans. So I was very sad to hear that. 20 years ago, no one knew what a social entrepreneur was. They just sort of glazed over when you used that phrase. And they said, oh, nice people working in one village, a drop in the ocean. Most people are beyond that because we're just too powerful. We've gone from local to national to global. And this figure is very incomplete. Ashoka is not included, for example, but the slope of the curve is very instructive. This is a very powerful historical transformation. And I wanted to share these charts with you because adjectives don't do it. Hard figures are much more persuasive. Now, where are the leverage points? Ashoka was created 22 years ago to help this transformation. And we're essentially trying to do two things. We started off with inventing venture capital modified for the citizen sector. And we're still learning how to do that. We're quite good at it. We're eager to help anyone who wants to do this. I don't have the ability and the time to explain how, but we've helped 47 other groups get started in this field. We'll help you find individual partnerships. Now, the second half is building the institutions, the collaborative processes, the synapses with the rest of the world. And I'll come back to that in a minute because that's where you'll see a number of the partnerships. But especially for those of you who don't know us well, let me introduce you, to make it concrete again, to two social entrepreneurs. Fabio cut the cost of rural electrification 70 to 80%. 1 million people have electricity as a result. Drew in India has free hotline telephones for street kids now in 45 cities and growing very rapidly. This changes the dynamic very profoundly. The service agencies never knew how to connect with the children at the moment of a crisis, or vice versa. This makes that connection. It causes accountability, coordination, and even the police now know that they've got to stay in line because trouble for them is a phone call away. The key is that the people answering the phone are also young people with the same background. Now, in the room, Inderjit Khurana, Ravi Agarwal, and David Green are 3 Ashoka Fellows. So you have on the screen and in person 5 people you can explore. What is the pattern here? There is a systems change of continental scale in the hands of someone who just cannot, by their core temperament, stop until they've changed the whole society. And there's just nothing more powerful. If you're looking for leverage points, a powerful idea in the hands of a real entrepreneur, there's just nothing more powerful. As I say, we're very happy to help you figure out how to do that. Now, the second, what am I doing here? Now, let me come to the second part, because here this is newer. As the individual life cycles evolve, you go from demonstrating and refining in one place, you've got to learn how to market or spread your idea, and then you're suddenly running a big organization and a big movement out beyond that. So the individual entrepreneurs need a full array of services over that life cycle. And as the charts earlier suggest, the whole field has matured. So we have many more opportunities now than we did 10 years ago to collaborate, to be much more than the sum of the parts. And here's where there are a whole series of opportunities. Yesterday there was a good deal of discussion, which I thought was wonderful, about the need to develop a base of support for this area. We have, as part of the professional association activities, a citizen-based initiative which runs competitions now in some 10 countries to tip our sector to know that it can, and here's how you build a broad base of money, people, information, and captive businesses. That's the functional equivalent in our sector of reaching the break-even point or the IPO. In this country, that's 94% of the funding base. You also need the institutional support before that, and that's why I'm encouraging everyone here to be entrepreneurial, and again, we'll try to help you. We have a series of ways of doing that. I'd like to focus, to be very concrete, on one type of partnership, on how we bring business and the social world together. When you have a new sector come up, you've got to figure out how it works with everyone else, because those relationships are profoundly changing. For 3 centuries, these two halves of society diverged. They spoke increasingly different languages, became incomprehensible to one another. Over the next decade, they're going to come together for collaborations and competition. And we're going to have a whole series of new institutions. This is a huge opportunity for everyone here. I'm just going to give you 2 examples of 11, and we have 11 business society bridge programs. but I think going into 2 will be more helpful. We have, over the last 6 years, created the Ashoka McKinsey Centers on Social Entrepreneurship. It took us 4 years to figure out how to do it in Brazil. We're now moving it to South Asia and opening up in Munich for Europe next 2 weeks from now. We put Ashoka people in the McKinsey office, find the right clients for McKinsey, the top people in the 3rd level of the life cycle of a social entrepreneur. You get a full McKinsey team, and you get the 3 centuries of business knowledge coming over to the citizen sector, and just as important, and parenthetically to the cutting edge of the citizen sector, the sorts of people you saw here, and other people in the field copy. Well, McKinsey is learning about housing or consumer protection or the sisal industry or whatever, and suddenly worlds that were terra incognita become a part of what they can help their clients, i.e. business, understand. So a partnership really has to be a 2-way win-win operation, and this is a big win for both sides. Now, I'm going to give you a second example. We're just starting and invite suggestions. We're beginning to work with the Nueva Group in Latin America, which is, by and large, the 2nd biggest building products company in each country and also a major forestry concern. Well, there are large numbers of social entrepreneurs around the world worrying about slums and housing and how to cut costs and provide better services. The business is looking for new markets. Well, an unattractive market, so-called, is an unserved market. Now, I'll just give you one concrete example. One of our fellows in northeastern Brazil has figured he can cut the costs of self-built housing for urban poor by about 40 or 50% by producing bricks that don't have to be fired, which saves a lot of energy and pollution and whatnot. There's an environmental consequence, but are water, salt safe and are not giving off emissions. It's been tested by a building products company here. He doesn't have the ability to get to scale. Well, you know, and there's no retail operation. Okay, I will be good. Available to him. The business company could provide that. It could open up a market. Well, if there are no retail, who's going to do it? Well, there are a lot of citizen groups in the slum, and they need sources of income. You can begin to see possibilities. Well, if you systematically take each sector and consciously sit down and get the 2 sides to think about how we can build win-win business, social, and environmental options, we can probably do it. Well, those are just 2 examples. One last thought. There is one thing more powerful than an idea plus an entrepreneur, and that's a whole bunch of us working together. And even more than that, all of us working together with the rest of society. And that's where the huge opportunity is. It always is. It's cutting across the boundaries. And my colleagues on the panel will help explore more partnership opportunities. Thank you.
Thank you. It's a real pleasure to be here. I've seen more friends in the last half hour since I've been here, and all of them have given me advice about what wasn't said yesterday, this is what you missed, and be sure to say this. So if I sound a little disorganized, it's that I tried in the last 5 minutes to incorporate much of this. And I should say, before I begin, there are people in this audience, I see Tim Worth back there, who have enormous experience with partnerships, and I think all of us with the private sector, and all of us would be willing to talk to you afterwards. If you want to contact me, I have a lot more information, obviously, than I can do before Glenn walks across and hands me a nasty note. And I'd be happy to respond to any of your questions. Short public service announcement. You have in your packet something called Global Giving Matters, which is an attempt to provide a kind of basic newsletter about individual global philanthropy. If any of you want to receive it, please send us an email. There's a note at the bottom about who to contact, and you will get it. And at the bottom of that is also an email address that will reach me. I come at this question of partnerships with the private sector from 3 perspectives. First, I'm a senior advisor on philanthropy to the World Economic Forum, where that's what we do. That's what we're thinking about. It's only a piece of what the forum is doing, and it's a kind of sub-piece, but that's a great place to begin this conversation. Second, with Melanie Oliveira, who is here, I am co-authoring a chapter on the influence of civil society on corporate responsibility, and that has produced a ream of information and a beginning of how do you think about this systematically, beyond anecdotes. And third, as president of the MacArthur Foundation, I really launched a number of partnerships with the private sector and began to think about what works. The first question that I asked at MacArthur was, where is a partnership appropriate? There are lots of cases and times where that doesn't work well, but there are lots of cases where it does. So you've got to make sure that you're trying to build a partnership in a place where it makes sense. Low-income housing has a myriad of examples, from LISC to the new NCDI initiative. It's a great place. Sustainable forestry. We first asked Weyerhaeuser to come to the table to meet with environmentalists, and here donors are great conveners. And they came only because they were terrified if they didn't come, there'd be some horrible publicity. And the next thing you knew, 3 years later, they were funding wonderful partnerships relating to sustainable forestry and had really turned around. So that's another case where it was good, which leads to what strategies do you have? I mentioned our role as a convener. It's hugely important, again, applied in the right place. You have to support civil society, because if you want to be partnerships, the private sector has to have someone with whom to partner. And it doesn't work very well if the private sector is funding the civil society side of that partnership. Governments aren't great funders of this. So that's where there's a huge and important role for philanthropy. And working with the private sector doesn't always meet the private sector's definition of with. I am not sure that Pacific Lumber would say that Julia Butterfly Hill was exactly working with them when she climbed into Luna, but clearly this was the necessary strategy of the moment. I'll come back to these in a couple minutes, but let me give you a little background. Why is the private sector important? Well, 51 of the world's largest economies are corporations. 200 of the top corporations in the world have sales that are equivalent to 1/4 of the world's economic activity. It seems to me this is something to pay attention to. The other problem is that while there are wonderful pieces of global governance in place, there really isn't the kind of system to bring all of this together and make it effective. And that's where also some of these private partnerships have almost moved beyond existing global governance structures. And finally, these large companies have enormous impact on what we call global public goods, air, water, etc. They can be influences for better or not so good. You may have forgotten already that DuPont took the initiative in bringing together a group of companies and governments to shape the Montreal Protocol, which then set standards for chlorofluorocarbons. This was huge, and it was DuPont's leadership that made that happen. On the other side, the Biological Weapons Convention enforcement discussions were totally undercut this spring by the United States with the influence of our pharmaceuticals because we withdrew from 6 years of very elaborate negotiations to come up with an enforcement mechanism. Now, our pharmaceuticals said we can't deal with on-site inspections. Well, what are we asking Saddam Hussein to do? Thank you very much, on-site inspections. Moreover, the European companies had found a way to live with the terms of that enforcement protocol. The United States walked away. This is an example, I think, of the corporate sector not using its influence to the best, and I have a wonderful other totally obscure one for you. I know all of you have heard of the country of Vanuatu. It is an obscure country in the Western Pacific. It would like to join the World Trade Organization. Well, in their effort to move forward their request to join the World Trade Organization, They have encountered the American tobacco, alcohol, and gun industry. They have said, the United States has said to them, if you wish to move forward and become a part of the WTO, you need to open up your markets more to guns, alcohol, and tobacco. This is not a good thing, I think. Vanuatu would like at least to keep its current gun control policy in place and U.S. guns out. Well, these are all areas where you need civil society in there with the voice. And now let's look at the other side. Civil societies have created a whole movement for corporate responsibility. None of this is new. It began ages ago, and there's a wonderful story about Thomas Clarkson, who in 1787 organized 400,000 people to boycott sugar from the Caribbean because of the slave trade. Adam Hochschild's new book, following up on King Leopold's Ghost, will be describing that whole civil society movement. Civil society and students, as you know, were very successful in forcing corporations to change their practices and in some cases withdraw from South Africa, which had some role in the change of government there. Today in Europe, Amnesty International, Greenpeace, and the World Wildlife Fund are more trusted than any multinational. This is a result of a poll amongst elites in Europe. In the United States, those three organizations rank among the top 20 organizations in terms of trust. Right now, civil society has a lot of legitimacy and a lot of opportunity. We are seen as real partners. At the same time, it's important to remember the role that corporate leadership can play. Unlikely allies are enormously important. And when John Brown, the head of BP, says that climate change is something we need to worry about, with due respect to any civil society group in this room, that means a whole lot more, and it means you have a partner. The rapid expansion of multinationals in the 90s has led to a huge increase also of civil society organizations with an international reach. Some of them are in address certain industries, the civil society groups, environmental, apparel industry, I'll get into that later. And they use two strategies. The outside strategy, spending 2 years in a tree, boycotting tuna, public information campaigns, as the NRDC did with the Baja California Bay. And taking corporations to court. But what happens is this interesting dynamic. Once the outsider brings something to the attention of the corporation, a lot of corporations are saying, okay, but I don't know what to do. I mean, you're sitting at McDonald's and all of a sudden a bunch of kids starting sending these styrofoam clamshells saying, you know, what are you packaging your stuff in this? What are you doing using this for packaging? And you're sitting at McDonald's, you call up the Environmental Defense Fund and say, I need help. And as a result of the partnership, McDonald's has saved 150 million tons of waste. Now, this has a huge impact on the environment, and they have managed to now use recyclable packaging for all of their products. Chiquita Banana situation is more complicated. They thought, as a result of pressure, they needed to do something that was be better environmental. And they made an alliance with an environmental group. And the next thing they knew, the labor rights group people were saying, we're left out, what can we do? And then they began to put together a whole complete package for improved practices. Last night I sat next to an investor on the plane, and he wanted me to assure you that the fact that Chiquita Banana is going into bankruptcy has nothing to do with this set of activities. It has to do with the banana wars in Europe. There are also industry-wide examples, and I was just talking to Catherine Marshall about this, and I think there's some question about whether this is really working. But it's very interesting. The mining industry said, we're having trouble getting local licenses. We can't keep working. Our whole business is in jeopardy. So they have put together an enormously complex multi-stakeholder process that includes mining industries and NGOs on one hand, and a group of independent assessors on the other hand, to verify the process. Now, there's some debate about whether this is working as well as some of the people claim it is, but it's an enormously interesting concept. And I think we're at the point in which people are saying, Let's experiment with a whole lot of new partnerships. Let's learn from them, and let's see what's working. Some of them involve large collaboratives. The Gates Foundation, as many of you know, is given, Tim will tell you, I think it's $30 million for Botswana, matched by Merck. A huge amount of money to deal with AIDS in Botswana, and this is a corporation, a foundation, and a government working together. Oh my God, and here's Glenn. The big movement is social investment, social investing. We have about 10% of all U.S. funds are involved in social investment. Amory Lovins will tell you how to redesign what you do so that you can save a whole lot of money. But let me just say, if we don't have people contributing and strengthening civil society, you don't have the partnership. The importance is to think strategically, to focus on policy changes so that you don't have just a series of isolated individual activities. And above all, you need to keep the grassroots advocacy groups strong so that the issues remain on the agenda. You cannot persuade me from all the research I've done that corporations are entering into the partnership because someone woke up some morning and said, this is a nice thing to do. We need to be out there and to be working, and there are fabulous people within corporations who are ready to work with us. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Adele and Bill. Now we'll hear from Lata Krishnan, President of the America-India Foundation.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I am particularly humbled and honored to be here among such distinguished speakers, and I'm particularly privileged to come from a religion called Hinduism, where we don't have just one goddess, but many, many goddesses, all smiling upon us. While in India 3-4 weeks ago, I had the experience of visiting one of the largest slums called Dharavi in Mumbai. Here I saw a group of 8 young boys cramped in a tiny dark room in a 2-story building over a large piece of silk material, and they were embroidering tiny beads into this cloth in front of them. They reminded me of my 9-year-old son, for whom I could not envisage this situation, a life like this, devoid of education, devoid of childlike pleasures, and devoid of a nurturing, loving home environment. Most of us believe that our differences are important and make our lives interesting. But the truth is that our common humanity is what matters more. This is the premise of the American India Foundation. I'm proud to be part of a community that embraces diversity, of a community that encourages every human being to reach his or her potential. Prior to coming to the US, I was raised in 3 different continents, Africa, Asia, and Europe, before settling down in the US. And so in some ways, I consider myself to be a global citizen. But this is home. The Bay Area is home. This is where my children were born and are being raised. But while this is home, a part of my heart will always belong to India. And this, I feel, is an important fact in the work that I do, leading an organization like the American India Foundation, an organization that has the dream of cultivating philanthropy among the diaspora community here. The foundation was born out of the rubble of the Gujarat earthquake in January of last year. President Clinton's leadership fired the imagination of the Indo-Americans here. This was a human calamity of such magnitude. 15,000 people died, 188,000 people were injured, many millions of homes were rendered, many millions of homes were destroyed. In our first year, we are only a 1-year organization. We celebrate 1 year this month. In our first year, our focus has been to rebuild and rehabilitate Gujarat, to build homes, to build schools, to build hospitals, to lend livelihood regeneration for artisans. And we feel that we've made much progress this last year. We raised $7 million, much of it for Gujarat, and we've built some wonderful partnerships with NGOs in India. India is a very complex country with many languages, cultures, and religions that are steeped in the social structure, much like Europe. It is also a nation that comes from a very rich cultural heritage, one that has produced some extraordinary people, both professionals and academicians, who have garnered a place in global history. For every one of 6 people in the world today, that one is a person of Indian origin. It is the largest democracy in the world. So working on enhancing the lives of people in India will, I believe, change the economic face of the entire world in the years to come. Peter Hero yesterday spoke of the 200,000 Indo-Americans in the Bay Area alone who have generated wealth over $25 billion. That's a staggering number. Cultivating this diaspora group, not to mention the remaining 1.5 million Indo-Americans in the rest of the U.S., is both our opportunity and our challenge. To take this number further, there are, I believe, 22 million Indians in about 60 countries, so that represents to us a much larger market opportunity. The challenges for developing a diaspora such as ours are manifold. We are a group that are very fragmented. We are a group that are geographically dispersed. We are a group that are not particularly one faith bound. We are a group that don't have an organized system of philanthropy that is built into our social structure. And we are a group that has a basic mistrust of giving through institutions. So we have our problems laid out in front of us. However, the beauty is that this is also a group that is highly intellectual, very entrepreneurial, as you can see in the Bay Area here, and compassionate as a community. So with this in mind, I believe that we have the opportunity to engage the hearts of people, engage their intellect, and engage their pockets to accelerate the development of India. In our minds, the diaspora we refer to is every individual, doesn't matter whether they are of Indian origin or not, but every individual that is interested in seeing India progress. Mahatma Gandhi said, "Be the change you want to see in the world." We want to be that. We are a bold and innovative organization with the hope of becoming a premier institution for India. But we also recognize that we are a young organization, an organization with much learning and much to do. I am particularly inspired by so many of the people here who have been involved in development work, and there are equally wonderful people in India who are involved in development work. We want to learn from all of you, leverage the strengths that you've already built, offer ours where they can be used, and together create meaningful and significant impact. This is not about, in my personal dream, this is not about building a few schools or a few hospitals. This is about taking the wealth of technology and resources and people here and changing the face of India by effecting policy. I think that's what we are about. We have an extraordinary cast of trustees and a board that I think can affect that over a period of time. Lord Keynes once said, how difficult it is for nations to understand one another, even when they have the advantage of a common language. As a community, we have to overcome this hurdle. Much has been said about the word charity, and much has been said about the word helping throughout the day yesterday. And in fact, who are we to help, really? I believe that every individual has the wherewithal to help themselves. We as NGOs or foundations are simply a catalyst or a facilitator. Let us not fool ourselves as to who is the true implementor. When we were constructing houses in Gujarat, it was in fact the families who were involved in every aspect of the building, all the way from the design of the building, and when I say a building, it's a 240 square foot home, so it's a very small home, but all the way from the design of that building to the actual building of the home, they took ownership. So AIF, the foundation, and the NGO were simply facilitators. This was a great example for us as to who we were as a player in this equation. My colleagues here today are speaking on partnering with local partners, the private sector, the government, and social entrepreneurs. We see ourselves as penetrating all 3 segments. It is crucial in a country like India where we want to affect education. This is one of our focus areas for this year. 95% of the education is run by the government. So in order to have significant, meaningful impact, we need to work with the government. We need to work with the private sector to make these programs sustainable. As an entrepreneur, I look at running AIF much as the same as I would running a for-profit organization. It has to be one that has fiscal prudence, accountability, transparency, and credibility, and most of all, understanding what the customer wants, and the customer in this case are people in India who have certain needs that need to be met. The big difference in my mind of a young company and the American India Foundation, or any foundation for that matter, is that with a young company, the exit strategy comes in the form of an IPO or an acquisition at a high valuation. I know this, I was there. With our work, I believe that every time we make a difference in the life of a child, or in the life of a woman, or in the life of a family, that is an exit strategy. So we have many, many exit strategies in front of us. This is one investment that will always have a positive return. There can be no other. So in conclusion, ladies and gentlemen, if the Indian diaspora can bridge the walls and chasms that separate social classes which have existed for thousands of years in India, which Ashoka, Akbar, and Gandhi worked very hard to eradicate, and if Indo-Americans who have bridged the gap among men and women, Muslims and Hindus here in America, then AIF with its Indo-American constituency can play a catalytic role in bridging that gap in India. This is our dream, and I hope that all of you will make it yours too. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Lata. Now we'll hear from Peter Bell, President of CARE.
Women of the world, I salute you. I salute you for who you are and for your commitment to our common humanity. I want to talk with you about the importance of partnerships locally for international non-governmental organizations like CARE. CARE has a vision, the kind of world that we want to see. I suspect it's a vision that is shared by many of you. We seek a world of hope, tolerance, and social justice. A world in which poverty has been overcome and in which everyone lives with dignity and security. And within that world, we seek to become a global force and a partner of choice in a worldwide movement dedicated to ending poverty. We truly believe that poverty can be ended. We don't accept the idea that the poor will always be with us. We think that the knowledge, the technology, the wealth already exists in today's world to end poverty. But what is sorely needed is the will and the organization to do it. To end poverty is not a simple matter. It means getting at the underlying causes of poverty. And absolutely essential to doing so is working at every level, at the global level, international organizations, the United Nations, governments around the world, corporations, philanthropies, international NGOs. But the bulk of the responsibility is at the local level. It is with organizations within the countries themselves. And thus, for an agenda as ambitious as our agenda, the idea of actually ending poverty and doing it in this century must work in literally thousands of partnerships. But no partnerships are more important than those with local organizations. It indeed is at the very center of CARE's vision of working with within a worldwide movement dedicated to ending poverty. And it is at the center of our mission of helping to create capacities for self-help within developing countries. Part of what gives us the capacity to build these partnerships is that of CARE's 12,000 employees around the world, more than 95% come from the societies with which we are working. This gives CARE strong roots within countries. The people on our staff and in the organizations with whom we partner understand their own problems better and are able to harness the resources more effectively than we could possibly do by ourselves. Partnership is a way of making our work more effective, more relevant, and more sustainable. Now, when I say local partners, what do I mean? And again, I'm talking about a variety of organizations. Sometimes these are national NGOs, many of which are well established and are nationally networked. Sometimes they're community-based organizations. They may be fishermen's cooperatives, women's savings groups, or youth organizations. Sometimes they're local authorities, municipalities, or village-level leadership. Or they could be local industry groups, chambers of commerce, or trade associations. The particular types of partnerships in which CARE works will vary from context to context. The structure and design of partnerships are tailored to the specific needs, objectives, and local capacities of each context. Let me give you at least a couple examples of partnerships. One is in the context of Somalia. There, CARE has been engaged in a set of relationships that were initiated back in 1993 after the spate of violence, war, and famine in Somalia. And it was in response to the need to work with NGOs for the rehabilitation and development in a situation where, in fact, no central government at all existed. And local government, when it did exist, was largely non-functional. And on top of all of that, there was an environment of great insecurity within the country. And a problem, even in some cases, of gaining access to certain communities and being able to move around freely in regions of the country. CARE set about identifying some 50 local non-governmental organizations with which we built relationships across the country, and worked with them to build their strength, to build their own mechanisms of governance and accountability, to provide, in some cases, technical training, and to respond to their priorities so that they could be more effective in reaching out to different parts of their country. These organizations, by and large, surprisingly, in some ways, have flourished within Somalia. For example, the CARE-trained Somali NGO Bani Adam operates a revolving loan fund to farmers, which has had a better than 95% repayment rate. The Somali agency AgroAction has assisted more than 1,000 local farmers to improve their yield through training, agricultural extension, and the construction of irrigation culverts and sluice gates. Other Somali partners with which we've worked in a Food for Work program have organized communities to rehabilitate more than 2,000 kilometers of roads in the past year alone. Many of these Somali NGOs are led by women, and the NGOs help to give voice to some of the most possessed and disadvantaged people within that society. And they are slowly but surely part of a larger movement as other organizations work with other NGOs toward building up within Somalia a civil society, one that we don't read very much about in the newspapers these days. CARE is also working in Brazil and has just begun there within the last year or so. And at the very outset, we identified, or our CARE Brazil Board of Directors and its staff identified, the southern part of Bahia as a place in which CARE should work. We went to the region, had various meetings with local NGOs, and gradually put together a set of priorities for a sub-region of the country there that included some 19 NGOs. They established a board of directors among themselves that meet on a twice-a-year basis, and a smaller executive committee made up, again, of representatives among those NGOs and of CARE, and also some local authorities. And they've established as their priorities work in increasing agricultural production, increasing access to markets, and making people within the communities with which they work aware of their basic rights. There are several implications of our being a partner-oriented organization. It has meant that the role of CARE has gone very much from having been a direct deliverer of goods and services to becoming much more of a facilitator, a capacity builder, and a catalyst. Partnership is not contracting with other organizations. It means much more than that. It's a much more mutually trustful, open set of relationships that we have built. And because we focus on building local skills and capacity through partnership and through community-level partnership, we obtain the participation and the buy-in of poor communities. Our development programs are more sustainable. In Afghanistan, for example, even under the Taliban, CARE was working with some 250 communities and providing support for community-based schools. The local communities actually provided the classrooms and paid for the teachers. CARE simply working with local NGOs, provided the textbooks and trained the teachers. 43% of these 23,000 children in those schools were girls. Those schools continued, virtually without exception, all 250 of them, throughout the recent war. They never stopped because the local organizations, the organizations of parents and elders that had supported them, stood by them and kept them going. And today we're expanding that number from 250 to 400. The bottom line is that local partnerships are absolutely essential to carry out our mission of fighting poverty more effectively around the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. And now we're ready to open up to questions from you all. We'll have roving mics that will come to you. So the first one who gets a mic goes. Here we go.
Hi, my name's Dan Siegel. I'm with New Visions. I had a question within the context of the various partnerships that were addressed by the panel, your reflection on partnerships that could be created within the foundation world, within philanthropy itself, being a very there's a great variety of financial service sector that you talked about, Bill. And we've heard about the power of small grants. The conference has mostly heard from larger independent foundations, but we know that there's great opportunity to leverage family foundation giving, community foundations, giving by individuals. And as an example, a few weeks ago at the Council on Foundations Family Foundation meeting, there was the first international panel held, and there was a challenge by a UK-based donor to leverage family foundation giving in the U.S. by a one-to-one match to give internationally. And I was wondering, there's different types of leverage schemes and examples that may be possible. Family foundations doing multi-grant collaborations internationally, as well as knowledge-based sharing of how larger foundations can share knowledge about international giving that we heard from Peter Hero yesterday. But any reflections within the various partnerships you're talking about how you forge those kind of partnerships within philanthropy itself to increase giving?
Adele?
My experience is that some of the best partnerships, which sounds a little unsystematic, emerge from personal relationships amongst the various actors involved. In Chicago, the MacArthur Foundation partnered with many of the foundations that only give locally in Chicago around specific problems. As a group of large foundations, we partnered with Rockefeller and Pew to form the Energy Foundation, which was a partnership of large foundations. There are huge opportunities, but I think what you identified is something that is emerging and that needs a lot of attention, and I've just been really thinking, as you know, when we talked about how to make it really work. What the large foundations have that's most useful at this point is less resources, it's knowledge. They have program officers, they have offices in China and India and all over. They have a lot of information. And what I want to work on now is how we can get some of that information and make it available to smaller individual donors and family foundations. I think that's a direction. We've always talked about partnership in terms of money. I think it's now knowledge.
Good. Yes.
Hi, my name is Zani. I'm from Burma. I want to call attention to one extraordinary woman that has not been mentioned in this extraordinary conference. We have this woman leader, Aung San Suu Kyi, 1991 Nobel Peace Prize winner, and she is leading a 14-year-long human rights struggle with the 50 million Burmese people. She was given a choice a couple of years ago to be with her dying husband in Oxford or to remain in the country under the house arrest, and she picked the latter. I don't know how I would have done it in her situation, and I think she would like to see all women in this conference room and others around the world to give her a hand of solidarity. My comment, particularly my appreciation to Professor Simmons for bringing up the issue of corporate responsibility, because I led 150 campus campaign to get corporations out of Burma. We have gotten close to 100 corporations out of Burma that were doing business with dictatorship over there. My comment is that I have been struck by the conversation and the direction it is going, because I think there's an extraordinary lack of attention to the role of political state in relation to the philanthropic work. I say that because there seems to be an assumption that the societies and peoples that the philanthropic community and private sector intend to help, sort of like one monolithic type of society. And then I don't have the statistic, but I would bet most countries in the world are in the grip of some type of authoritarianism. And in my opinion, there are two types of civil society groups. One that focus on humanitarian work, education, social services, clean air, and the other that focuses on dislodging authoritarianism, so that the civil society groups can actually shape the state, actually turn the state into a democratic state. And so there is a lack of attention on the part of the philanthropists and individuals who are well-meaning, well-intentioning, to the support or to the inadequate resources that other directly politically involved civil society groups, i.e., national liberation movements. I think without that without attention to that, I think we're going to be treating the symptoms. Because when we talk about children on the streets, young girls being sold into sexual slavery, where I've talked to hundreds and hundreds of young girls from Burma being sold into brothels in Thailand, myself, and those things are a direct result of the authoritarian state and how it manages the economy. So I think I would want us to move the discussion to incorporate the missing piece of state. And finally, I think because this is predominantly entrepreneurial type of folks here, correct me if I'm wrong, there seems to be a mythology at work that the state, the political state, is dispensable for business practices, and because that's not simply true. The state provides security, law, regulations, and also like the win contracts for investors. So I would like to bring the state back to the conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Why don't we start with Peter?
I agree with your comments, but I think, and there are sort of direct approaches to the issue that you've raised, but I think all of us who are engaged in support of work and development, of reducing and trying to end poverty, need to look at a whole range of underlying factors, and one factor is certainly authoritarian, corrupt governance. There are others as well. There are issues of discrimination, issues of gender equity, and a number of other underlying factors. One of the approach, a really basic approach that CARE has increasingly committed itself to, is taking what we call a rights-based approach to our programmatic work. That is, helping not only to increase the capacities of people in poor communities to go as far as they can in realizing their rights to basic education.
Something quite extraordinary. In 1995, it passed a law requiring that all pension funds report that all companies that the UK pension funds invest in report on their social and environmental risk and also what they are doing. This takes effect this year, actually took effect in 2001. You are going to see massive change in UK investments. This is happening in France and Germany. The United States is far behind. But I think that corporations, to come back to your foundation piece, foundations can lead the way in making this happen. You all know the rate of returns. The Domini has outperformed the S&P. There is no excuse for us not moving in this direction. I don't think I could have said that when I was president of the MacArthur Foundation.
We will bring you in to consult on this one. Clearly, Adele has more interesting plane travel than I do. Yes, over here.
Chertok from Global Catalyst Foundation. The partnership between donors and foundations on the one hand and social entrepreneurs and NGOs on the other hand is challenging, especially because of the power dynamic and how easy and tempting it is for donors to be calling the shots in these relationships. I'd be interested in hearing how in each of your organizations you're working to achieve true equitable partnerships.
Good. Lata, would you like to begin?
Sure. I think one of the important aspects of running a foundation that we're sort of struggling with is that The donor community is very interested in getting recognition for the work that it does or for the donation that it's making. But I think it's important to instill within the foundation an independence, because that's really what we are offering the community at large. And so I think what we are trying to build within our organization is an environment where it's not personality driven, but it's based on cause. And I think if we can do that over a period of time and earn the respect of not just the donor base, but the NGO base as well, then we'll go a long way in building that relationship between the donors and us.
Anyone else? Bill?
This is a very sensitive question, and it's very important. McKinsey did a wonderful analysis, market analysis. I told some of you about this yesterday. When we were entering the U.S., they were talking to people in the social entrepreneurial community here about what they needed and didn't need. And it became very clear when they were asked about training, for example. Oh, these people make us go to these training meetings, and it's just not very useful, and so on down through the sequence. And it's not that people don't need training. They do, but they know what they need. And as in business, listen to the clients. Have the humbleness and sensitivity to know what the client wants. We have designed ourselves, to answer your question about what we're specifically doing, as an association of leading social entrepreneurs, and everything about the design is intended to get away from the power relationship and all the negativeness and dishonesty that it brings. So the only funding that we do is at the first point of election. It's not renewable. We don't have the financial issue involved after that point. We're also, parenthetically, thought it would be harmful to help people too much financially, because in the early stages they've got to figure out their long-term financial base. Through the collaborative fellowship, we can help open doors and introduce, and people have to figure out to go through those doors themselves. Evaluation is another very sensitive issue. It's been used predominantly as a backward-looking, control-oriented, someone else's agenda. The word is so negative that we avoid it. And it's not that we don't need it. People, of course, need to assess where they've been, but you can work it into the strategy going forward. There's a whole series of ways to do that. I could go on with the examples, but this is just an absolutely fundamental point. The smartest way of investing is to be humble enough to recognize that you're serving the clients. You're partnering with the clients. You're not controlling them. And this is a problem of a monopolistic financial sector dealing with the now competitive citizen sector, especially with the social entrepreneurs. And this is part of the transition. You look at the new financial services institutions, they're trying to do exactly what you suggest. It's fundamental first principle of the partnership relationship.
Thank you. Peter?
Could I just, I think it is a critical issue that you've raised. And I know, I'm speaking very frankly, when Jim Wolfenson of the World Bank tells me that he wants to be CARE's partner, I get very nervous. and it's not because I don't, in many respects, admire the changes that he has helped to bring about within the bank. But I can empathize with how local organizations might look and turn to CARE. And what we have found 6 years ago, when we first, in our then long-range strategic plan, committed ourselves to the centrality of partnerships, what we found was, within a year or two, everyone said they were doing partnerships all around the world. And then we began to look at what in practice that meant. And it wasn't exactly what we had in mind in many, many cases. And what we found is that we have to engage in a lot of training. There are some people who excelled in an earlier care who will not excel in the care that is evolving. We need to put much more emphasis on skills and negotiation, patience, and build capacity to build relationships. Importance of diversity, it's absolutely critical. And also this rights-based approach that I was talking about is also very important because we're helping to build on the strengths of other people. We're not we're not meeting needs, we're fulfilling responsibilities that we have as citizens of the world.
Thank you. Yes.
There's another area of partnering that we haven't addressed that I think is really important, and that also is within the philanthropic community, and that is partnering in advocacy. There are issues out there that if we all got behind, for almost no money, we can make significant moves. The one I'm thinking of particularly is debt forgiveness of the poor nations. This is something that if we all started advocating could have a tremendous impact, and yet it takes everyone getting a movement together and really, it's almost like I think of drunk driving, that until the will of the people became apparent, nothing happened there. But, so it's advocacy and foundations being willing to stand up and say, this is something, an idea that's time has come, can have a tremendous impact for almost no grant dollars. It's something that we just have to be willing to stand up for. I wonder how we organize this kind of thing and how we become more pro in advocacy in our foundations.
Thank you, Adele.
First, it helps to have Bono on your side. And, there's no question that the debt forgiveness movement is just an example of lots of others where, among other things, you need to be coordinated. It's important to get advocacy groups, in some cases really worldwide, connected and working together. And as you say, it doesn't take a lot of foundation money. It takes grassroots organizing. It takes choosing messages so that everybody's got some focus at the same time. And it takes foundations being willing to make a strong and powerful commitment. You need to understand that you can't be partnering all the time. You need to stand up and insist and really be committed behind your values. So I'm a great believer in partnership with advocacy. I also think you have to listen. I think too often foundations will say, and this is how to do it. And this is an area where I call almost the institutionalization of the dishonest relationship between foundations and grassroots groups is a problem. It's only going to be effective if there's grassroots organization, commitment, and it's organized, and foundations aren't trying to dictate it themselves. So we need more of it. We need to be, particularly with the environmental destruction that we're seeing coming from policies out of Washington while we're all focusing on Enron and Afghanistan, we really have to get these voices stronger, louder, and heard.
I'd like to just add to that a moment because a few things come together here, and that is I'd purport that partnerships between foundations can oftentimes, if led by a strong foundation with an ethic of partnering, of listening, of understanding the strength of local NGOs, can set the tone for a partnership and build a very powerful group that is softer in voice than perhaps any one of us would be. Here in this area, we have many examples, including this conference, where a very perhaps more fledgling foundation than ours or those that Adele represented really led the way and got some of the big foundations involved who had a voice, but a very equal voice with many other more entrepreneurial foundations that whose character really came through loud and clear, and that's been very, very useful and helpful to those of us in larger foundations. Subjugating us. Yes.
In terms of advocating, I have a specific suggestion I'd like the panel to respond to, and that is, with the need to increase more international giving, I think we need to look at why it's not been happening, and I think there are two primary reasons. One is a lack of awareness about the need and the opportunities, and we're addressing that some here with organized philanthropy. But organized philanthropy already gives about 11% of all foundation grants go abroad, but only about 1.8%, according to the Foundation Center, of individual giving gets abroad. And I think that the second thing that has to happen, besides increasing awareness about needs and opportunities, we have to look at the institutional barriers for giving abroad. And I think for foundations, I think we need to do a careful study of per transaction cost. What does it cost to make a grant abroad? And what can be done to lower that barrier? We need to raise awareness on one hand, and on the other hand, we need to lower the barriers. And for individuals can't make tax-deductible gifts abroad at all. And I think that we ought to really be talking about radical changes to the tax law to make it easier for private foundations and public foundations to make gifts abroad, and maybe even consider a 200% tax deduction or even a tax credit for individuals to make gifts abroad. And I'm puzzled by why these kind of ideas aren't being discussed.
That's a whole other conversation about where we go beyond where we are, but I think it's important to say that there are a lot of intermediaries to which we can give tax-deductible contributions right now that are connected with very local grassroots activities. CARE is one, the Global Fund for Women is others. We can immediately increase the amount of money flowing from the United States to developing countries overseas. Great. Terrific. There are people looking at the tax barrier questions and also looking at it within the developing countries. And for example, Barnett Barron at the Asia Foundation is onto this. This is a part of the field that's moving forward, perhaps too slowly, but there is some momentum.
Next, yes.
One quick thing I want to say is that, to Michael's question, when we actually get into giving money, I often feel like a Hollywood agent. On one hand, balancing incredibly creative, passionate NGOs. On the other hand, balancing financially demanding donors. And I think what works mostly is to really start with a contract, that you actually put in writing what you both would like to do. However rudimentary it is, we don't use lawyers or anything. We just, in colloquial language, write down what we both are agreeing that might change over a period of time. And that creates an incredibly good relationship to start with. And second thing I want to say is that before we applaud ourselves on the cultural diversity that's here, looking around at the room, I would say we have a long way to go. And I think it's not just cultural diversity in the people we employ, it's a cultural diversity in people who run these organizations. We really need people from all around the world to actually run these organizations. And finally, the most important partnership we have to think about is partnership with our families. And I think none of us would be here today if we didn't have that partnership with us. And I think before I celebrate being in a Women's Day, I think I'm here because of an incredible father and a great husband. So I think as today to start, we got to give a great hand to the extraordinary men who are here and to the men in our lives. Thanks.
Thank you. We have time for just one more question. Yes.
From the World Bank, representing Jim Wolfenson, who is very disappointed that he can't be here. He shares, I think, the passion and exactly the same issues of where is the link between money, ideas, catalytic role, and vision. And I think he very much shares many of the visions that have come, whether Peter Bell and others, of the fight against international poverty. I have heard some comments about the partnership with the multilateral institutions, but would like to underscore how important the partnership with people in this room is to the World Bank and the other international organizations. And there are thousands of ideas, literally, that have come to mind. We have many partnerships with many of you, but I have a sense of a vast potential for others. And just as some of the topics that have come to mind, the fight against corruption, community-based development, the role that social funds play in countries in trying to set up sustainable mechanisms to support grassroots, community, and other organizations, the role of gender, the vast scholarship programs that are designed to help the people who've not had a chance to study abroad who are in the mid-career. So there are just a host of opportunities, and if there's anything that I can do both to learn from you and to learn from the experience here and to help in making some of the connections that we all know in networks are so important, I'm happy to do it. One last story. Fidel Ramos, former president of the Philippines, told a story in a meeting that we had that was on the topic of corruption, but that I think has application more broadly. His story was that there's a kind of cake in the Philippines where you have obviously to have all the right ingredients and you mix them together, but then you have to cook it in a way where you have fire from above and fire from below. And I think that that's part of what we're trying to have is the fire from above, the leadership, the vision at the global and the national level, but without the fire from below, which is the civil society and the communities, we're not going to succeed in changing the world and looking to a future where people have dignity and rights.
Thank you. That's wonderful. We now have fire and water, so we're almost there in our imagery. That's terrific. I just want to make a comment as we wrap up here. First, many thanks to our panelists. We will be moving next into breakout sessions, and Adele Simmons has kindly agreed to participate in the breakout on donor education. I'd also like to remind you of sort of the course of this morning through lunch. At the end, we will conclude with lunch, and at 1:30, Kate Greswold and John Morgridge will speak, and we'll introduce the photographer Sebastião Salgado, a real treat for us to have here. You will find his photographs and his story completely compelling, so please look forward to that. Our breakout location of the lunch is, what? Yes, is at lunch. We will, after the next breakout sessions, we will then move back in for lunch, which will include a part of the program beginning at 1:30 with John and Kate and concluding with Mr. Salgado. Next, we will move into breakout sessions, which are down the hall. You will see signage to lead you there, but please feel free to ask anyone that you see that looks official where to go, right here in the same building. Thank you.